Hansel and Gretel were real, and they escaped a killer during a famine. Once upon a time, not in a fairy tale, but in the darkest chapter of Europe's past, a famine swept across the land like a slow, merciless hand. It was the year 1315, and across the kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, nothing grew. The rains came, but not the kind that watered crops. The skies poured without end. Fields flooded, wheat rotted in the mud, livestock dropped dead. And with every week that passed, the people grew thinner. In a small village on the edge of what is now Germany, nestled against the Black Forests, lived a family of 4. A father, a stepmother, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy was named Hans, sharp as a thorn and quiet as snow. The girl was Greta, clever, bold, and unafraid to speak her mind, even when it got her in trouble. They were not princes or nobles. Their father was a woodcutter. He had strong hands, sad eyes, and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. He worked all day just to return home with splinters and nothing else. The stepmother had a name once, but it was long forgotten, even in Greta's memory. She wasn't cruel at first, not really. But hunger changes people, and when your own belly growls louder than your conscience, cruelty can become survival. The family shared a single loaf between them one night. Hans gave his to Greta. Greta broke it in half and returned it. Their father said nothing. The stepmother stared into the fire with eyes like cold metal. That winter, neighbors began to disappear. First the old, then the sick, then the poor. Some fled the village in search of food. Others never made it far. Stories began to spread, whispered around dying hearths, of children vanishing in the woods, of strangers knocking on doors in the night, of something darker than hunger living among the trees. Hans didn't believe in monsters. Greta did. But both of them knew something was wrong when they woke up to an empty pantry and their stepmother whispering to their father in the dark. "We can't feed them. They'll starve anyway." "They're our children." "They're your children." The next morning, their father took them by the hand. "We're going to gather wood," he said. He didn't look at them when he said it, didn't meet their eyes. They walked deeper into the woods than ever before. Greta counted the steps. Hans dropped pebbles, smooth white ones he'd hidden in his pocket just in case. Their father stopped at a clearing. "Wait here," he said. "I'll be back soon." He walked into the trees and never returned. Greta didn't cry. Hans didn't scream. They waited until nightfall. Then Hans stood up and looked at the moonlight. "Follow me," he said, and they walked. Hans found the pebbles gleaming under the moon, one by one like a trail of stars. By dawn, they were back home, dirty, cold, but alive. Their father wept when he saw them. The stepmother did not. "They found their way back," she said. "They're smart," he replied. "That's the problem," she muttered. 2 nights later, the children awoke to whispers again. This time, Hans had no pebbles. The door had been locked. Greta tried to argue. The stepmother shouted. The father didn't speak at all. They were taken back to the forest. Deeper this time. No trail, no bread, no way back. "Wait here," their father said again. "I'll return." Greta looked him in the eye this time. "Will you?" His lip trembled. But he left anyway. This time they did not wait. Hans took Greta's hand and they ran. They didn't know where. Only away. And in their flight, hungry, lost, and half-frozen, they stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. Smoke, rising from a chimney in the middle of the forest. A cottage, hidden, alive, and not abandoned. Greta reached the door first. She knocked. It opened. Not a monster, not a witch, a woman. Old, kind-eyed, soft voice. "Poor dears," she said. "Come inside. Come warm yourselves." Hans hesitated. Greta did not. And that was the moment everything changed. The cottage looked like it had been built before the forest itself. Its stones were dark and mossy, half swallowed by vines. Its roof sagged like it was tired of holding secrets. Smoke drifted lazily from the crooked chimney, scented with something strange, sweet and savory at the same time, like honey boiled in broth. Greta stepped in first. Hans hesitated at the door. The old woman smiled gently. Her skin was thin, stretched like paper. Her hands shook slightly as she beckoned them forward. "Come, children, sit by the fire. It's a cold night." They were cold. Freezing, in fact. Their hands were purple, their feet raw. And the cottage was warm, almost too warm. The fire crackled. The walls were lined with old shelves stuffed with jars of herbs, roots, even bones. A black pot simmered over the hearth, steam curling through the air like a whisper. The woman gave them blankets, poured water into wooden cups. Then she handed them food. Actual food, not broth, not scraps. Real bread, thick slices of roasted turnip, bits of meat, salty, rich. Greta ate without thinking. Hans took smaller bites, watching her. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. The woman smiled. "I've lived here many winters. I prepare." Greta's eyes were already closing. The warmth had wrapped around her like a fog. Her body gave in to sleep, cradled by the scent of food and fire. Hans did not sleep. He stayed awake, his back to the wall, watching the woman. She sat in the corner, not moving, not blinking, just staring into the fire and humming. A tune that sounded wrong, not in its melody, but in its memory, as if he'd heard it before, but not with music, with screams. In the morning, Greta woke with a smile. Hans didn't, because something had changed. The woman had moved them during the night. They were now on straw beds in a room at the back of the cottage. The windows were shuttered. The door had no handle from the inside. "It's just to keep out the cold," the woman said. But there was no cold, only silence. Hans began to notice things. The floor creaked, but not under their steps, as if something below was shifting. The pot over the fire never stopped boiling, even when the firewood was gone. The meat she served never ran out, and always tasted slightly strange. And then he found the bone. Greta had dropped her spoon. When he bent to pick it up, he saw something near the fire. Not a pig's knuckle, not a lamb shank. A finger, human. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He waited. That night, he whispered to Greta, "We're not guests. We're food." Greta laughed, and until she saw his face. "We have to leave," he said. "The woods are safer than this." She didn't argue again. The next morning, Hans pretended to be sick. The old woman came to his side with a crooked spoon. "Eat, child," she said. "You'll need your strength." "Why?" he asked. Her smile cracked something in her face. A twitch, a flicker. "Winter's long, and the strong survive." When she left, Greta searched the cottage. While pretending to clean, she opened a door the woman never let them touch. What she found made her drop the bucket. Hooks, chains, old shoes, dozens, tiny bones, a stack of children's clothing in neat folded piles. One pile had her scarf on top. She didn't scream. She closed the door, and she ran back to Hans. "Tonight," she whispered. "We leave tonight." But the woman knew. That night, she locked the doors, the shutters, even the chimney flew. Hans and Greta were trapped. She stood in the kitchen, humming, sharpening a long knife on a stone. Her shadow stretched across the cottage like a second body. "You should have stayed asleep," she said. "Like the others." Hans stepped forward. What others? The ones who begged, who cried, who asked me to let them go. She turned, eyes shining like candlelight. You know what's worse than famine? Hope. Hope keeps them from tasting right. Greta moved behind her, quiet as a breath. But you're smart, the woman said, turning back to Hans. You didn't eat much. You've been watching me. That's good. I like to play with my food. So do I, Greta said, and she slammed the iron pot lid over the woman's head. She didn't fall, not at first. She hissed, spun, grabbed Greta by the hair. Hans leapt at her with the fire poker, driving it into her side. The scream that followed wasn't human. It shook the walls. The fire flared, then died. They didn't stop. Greta ripped a cloth from the shelf and blinded her. Hans opened the hidden door beneath the hearth. The woman clawed the air, cursing in a language they didn't know. They dragged her to the basement, and what they saw there was hell. Bones, dozens, maybe hundreds. Children, adults, half buried, half boiled. The walls were stained with soot and old blood. Shove her, Greta said. Hans hesitated. Do it! He shoved. The woman tumbled into the pit. She didn't die, not at first, but the fire they lit burned for hours. And when it was over, they were free. Smoke poured from the chimney for hours. It didn't smell like wood. Hans and Greta stood outside the cottage, faces lit by orange flickers that danced through the cracks in the stone. The door was broken. The shutters hung loose. The wind moved through the house like a sigh of relief, like the place itself had been waiting for someone to destroy it. Greta held Hans's hand tight. She's gone, Greta whispered. Not yet, Hans muttered. Not until we leave this place behind. But where could they go? The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. They had no food, no map, no plan. Only each other. They walked for what felt like days. Greta guided them east, using the moss on the trees. Hans kept checking behind them, not for the woman, but for whatever else might be watching. At night, they slept under roots, wrapped in a blanket they had stolen from the cottage. Greta had also taken a satchel of dried bread and something else, a leather-bound book she'd found beneath the floorboards. She didn't know why she grabbed it. Something about the way it was hidden felt important, dangerous. By the third day, they found a stream. Hans drank first, then Greta. That's when she opened the book. It wasn't a spell book, not exactly. It was a ledger, a list, dozens of names, maybe hundreds. Each name was written with a symbol beside it. Some were crossed out, some had dates, some had places. But one thing was clear. They weren't random. They were children. She kept records, Greta whispered. She hunted them. Hans pointed at the name at the very bottom. It was Greta's, and below it, his. They didn't speak for a long time, but that night, they made a choice. We can't just run, Greta said. She's gone, but the names, this list, it's real. We're just children, Hans said. Exactly, she replied, and so were they. They turned west, toward the village. Not to return home, but to find answers. It took another 2 days to reach the edge of the village. They saw smoke rising, not from fire, but from chimneys. Life still existed there, barely. They crept through the woods until they saw a man chopping wood. Their father. Greta almost ran to him, but Hans grabbed her arm. Wait! The stepmother came out of the cottage. She was laughing and holding a coin pouch heavy with silver. They waited until nightfall. Then they crept to the window. What they heard chilled them more than any winter. They're dead by now, the stepmother said. That woman never misses. Did you see what she paid this time? For 2? They were just children, their father whispered, his voice barely holding together. We are too, she snapped. Children of war, of famine. This is survival. They were mine, and now we live because of it. Greta's hands clenched into fists. Hans didn't speak. They didn't knock. They didn't go inside. They just walked away. 3 nights later, they arrived at a neighboring village. Greta showed the mayor the ledger. She didn't cry. Hans pointed to the last pages, names of children who had vanished over the past few years, children whose families were told they'd wandered off, gotten lost, eaten by wolves. But the book told the truth. She sold us, Greta said. But we didn't die. We escaped. The mayor called the guards. The church bell rang. Soon the story spread, not as a whisper, but a fire. Over the next month, children were found. Some alive, most not. Hidden graves in the woods, bones under trees, clothing tied to roots, and one name came up again and again, the widow Mierda. The woman in the woods, once a midwife, later accused of witchcraft, banished decades ago. No one had seen her since. But children kept disappearing. The famine made it easier. No one questioned a vanishing. No one went into the forest until Hans and Greta. They weren't just survivors now. They were witnesses. And in time, they became something more. Symbols, warnings. The children who escaped the house no one came back from. The siblings who turned the legend of a witch into a real case of human evil. But legends are stubborn. And as years passed, the truth blurred. People added their own details. The cottage became one made of candy. The woman became a magical witch. The children left breadcrumbs instead of pebbles. And in time, the horror became a bedtime story, a fairy tale. But Greta never forgot. She kept the ledger with her always. And Hans? He learned to listen for footsteps behind him, just in case someone else remembered too. Because stories fade. But monsters adapt. Hans and Greta thought survival was the end of the story. They were wrong. After exposing the ledger, after helping the guards uncover bones buried beneath centuries of roots, after pointing fingers at names people didn't want to remember, they found themselves not hailed as heroes, but feared. At first, there were questions, praise, pity. But soon came the suspicion. Why did they survive? How did 2 children defeat a grown woman? What really happened in that house? Rumors breed faster than truth, especially in hungry towns. The mayor, who once promised protection, suddenly began to ask questions with sharp edges. He ordered the ledger locked in the church vault, for safekeeping. Hans protested. Greta demanded it back. But the door stayed locked. 3 weeks after they arrived, a visitor came to town. A tall man in fine black robes, gold trim, cold eyes. He was from the bishop's court. He came not to honor Hans and Greta, but to discredit them. Witchcraft, he said, lies spread by frightened children. There was no ledger, no bones, just fever dreams and pagan superstition. Hans argued. Greta shouted. The bishop's man warned them, "If you continue speaking, we will charge you with heresy. Children can be possessed too." The town turned colder. Doors stayed shut. Eyes avoided theirs. Some said they were cursed now. Others said they'd made a deal in that forest, that they hadn't escaped, but been marked. One night the church caught fire. The vault where the ledger was stored burned to the ground. No one was hurt, but the ledger, the only proof, was gone. And with it, the last fragile thread of belief in their story. The next morning, Greta woke to find Hans gone. No note, no tracks. Nothing. She ran from door to door, but no one opened, not even the mayor. When she finally reached the river, she saw them, 2 guards dragging something heavy through the reeds. A sack. She screamed. They ran. But the sack was empty, just stones, a warning. Stop talking." Greta didn't stop. She left the village, crossed borders, wandered from town to town, telling the story to anyone who would listen. Sometimes they did. Most times, they didn't. She grew older, harder, quieter. She kept a second copy of the names. She wrote down every new disappearance she heard about, every family who lost a child during the famine. She mapped them. The pattern was clear. The woman in the woods had not been working alone. Across the countryside, whispers grew of a network, not witches, but desperate people, traders, smugglers, murderers who preyed on the weak, who saw famine not as tragedy, but opportunity. Children were currency, and Greta had seen the receipt. But she was alone now. And the world did not want to listen. Until one night, 15 years later, a man approached her in a tavern in the mountains. Greta was older now, scarred, watching the fire with eyes that didn't blink. The man sat beside her and said nothing, until he whispered, "The pebbles worked. I came back." She turned and saw Hans, alive. He told her everything. The guards had tried to kill him, but he escaped, living in the woods for years, hiding from bounty hunters who called him a liar. He'd used the old paths they once walked as children, followed the stream, survived on roots and silence. He never stopped watching. He never stopped listening. And like Greta, he'd seen the pattern too. The disappearances, the silence. The stories turned into fairy tales to hide the horror. "They want it forgotten," he said. "Then we make them remember," she answered. Together again, they did what no child had ever done before. They wrote the truth. A full account, names, places, maps, what they saw, what they did, what no one wanted to hear. They carved copies into stone, hid them in woods, buried them in abandoned wells, painted symbols onto trees and secret codes, hoping one day someone would understand. But they didn't live long enough to see the world believe them. Greta died in a winter storm. Alone in a chapel she built herself. Hans disappeared a year later. Some say he was taken. Others say he vanished by choice, returning to the trees where it all began. No graves were marked, no songs were sung, but the story remained, not in scrolls or history books, but in fairy tales, softened, twisted, stripped of truth. The witch became a symbol, the forest a fantasy, and the children? They were reduced to breadcrumbs. The names were lost, the ledger was burned. The village was buried under newer towns, newer maps, newer lies. But the story survived, not as Greta had told it, not as Hans had lived it, but in pieces, scattered like breadcrumbs in the dark. Over time, the details changed. The old woman became a witch, the woods became a fantasy, the house, a candy-covered illusion, harmless, sweet, marketable. Because the real version, the one with bones in the basement, the one with children sold for silver, the one with towns that stayed silent, was too real, too close, too possible. So storytellers softened it. They turned horror into bedtime stories, survival into symbols, and they called it Hansel and Gretel. But some parts remained unchanged. The trail, the abandonment, the fire, the escape, the fear. Those truths clung to the story like stains that no amount of polish could remove. And sometimes, in older versions told in remote villages, you can still hear fragments of the original tale. She cooked more than bread. The children never slept again. The forest still remembers. Centuries passed. Books came and went. The brothers Grimm wrote their version in the 1800s. They heard whispers of a local story, of siblings, famine, a killer woman in the woods, but they couldn't print what they found in the old letters. It was too brutal, too real. So they softened it, changed names, sweetened the house, removed the hunger, replaced it with magic. But in the margins of one of the earliest copies of their manuscript, There's a scribbled note, barely legible. This tale is older than we thought. Real names were Hans and Greta. Their story was not a fable, but a warning. And so here we are, hundreds of years later. Still telling the story, still forgetting what it means, still thinking the witch was the scariest part. But maybe, just maybe, the real monsters weren't hiding in the woods. Maybe they were the people who looked away, who sold their children, who burned the truth, who smiled and said, "It's just a fairy tale." Sometimes the scariest thing ain't what lives in the forest. It's what people do when the world runs out of food and out of love. And if you ever hear a story that sounds too awful to be true, remember, that's what they said about this one too. So if you made it this far, don't forget, truth hides behind stories, and sometimes what we call legends are just buried screams, like comment and subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells, where every story may be older, darker, and more real than you ever imagined. Because the woods, they're still out there, and they never forget.